Toronto, Canada, winter of 2022. The cold had a way of softening the city's noise, as if every rooftop and every stretch of frozen pavement were holding their breath. Snow collected along the windows of the small apartment where Cristian lived with his parents, a humble family, rooted in quiet faith and gentle routine. They were not scholars, not historians, not seekers of forgotten relics. They were simply people who tried to live with dignity, work hard, and thank God for what little they had. His father, Samuel, delivered packages across the city, often returning home with tired hands and a grateful smile. His mother, Elena, worked in a retirement home, where she whispered prayers into the silence whenever the elderly drifted into sleep. Their life was simple, composed of small rituals: hot soup after work, candles lit on Sunday evenings, and a soft hymn whispered before bed. Nothing in their world suggested that something ancient, impossibly ancient, was about to touch their lives. Nothing indicated that their 5-year-old son would soon carry words that seemed older than memory itself. Cristian was a serene child, quiet in a way that made adults pause. He didn't seek attention, didn't cry for toys, didn't demand anything from the world. Instead, he watched with an intensity that shouldn't belong to someone so young. His dark eyes held an unusual stillness, as if he were listening to something beneath the ordinary hum of life, something hidden under the layers of the everyday. Sometimes, while Elena cooked, she would glance at him and find him staring at the flickering stove flame, as if mesmerized by something far beyond the room. At other times, he would sit in the living room with his tiny hands resting on his knees, eyes half closed, like a child trying, unconsciously, to remember a dream slipping away. He never acted strangely enough to frighten his parents, but often enough to stir an inexplicable awareness inside them, as if Cristian's silence carried the faint echo of something sacred. The first sign, though subtle, arrived on a Sunday morning. The family had returned from church, shaking snow from their coats, when Cristian walked to the small wooden cross that hung near the kitchen door. He touched it with the tips of his fingers, something he had done countless times. But that day, he lingered, his head tilted slightly, his eyes rising not with curiosity, but with recognition. "Elena," Samuel whispered, watching him. "He's different today." "Only quiet," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Deep down, she felt it too, a shift in the air, a softness, almost like a blessing settling over the room. Cristian finally stepped back from the cross and turned to them with an expression they couldn't decipher. Not fear, not confusion. Something else. Something contemplative, almost ancient in its calm. But he said nothing. He simply returned to his small chair and folded his hands neatly on his lap. Days passed. Snow thickened over Toronto. Life continued in its gentle rhythm. But the quiet moments around Cristian began to feel charged, as if invisible threads of meaning were pulling themselves together, preparing the world for something that had been waiting centuries to resurface. One night, as the wind howled through the narrow spaces of the apartment building, Elena found Cristian awake in the living room. He sat near the window watching the sky, not the snow, not the city lights, but the sky itself, as though expecting someone. She felt a question rise in her throat, but something sacred restrained her. Instead, she wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and sat beside him in silence. There was a peace around him, a deep and unsettling peace, like the soft glow that comes before dawn, when the world has not yet decided whether to sleep or wake. And in that moment, Elena realized something both beautiful and terrifying. Cristian did not observe the world like a child discovering it. He observed it like someone remembering it. And if you had been there, yes you, and seen that small silhouette framed against the winter sky, You might have felt the same quiet tremor Elena felt. The sense that something was approaching, slow and deliberate, like a truth long buried under dust and centuries finally finding a way back to the surface. You might have wondered, have you ever encountered a child like that? One who doesn't need to speak to change the atmosphere around them. One whose very presence feels like the first page of a forgotten scripture beginning to open. A scripture waiting, a voice awakening, a mystery older than the world Cristian had been born into. Winter deepened over Toronto, and with it, something else deepened in Cristian. Something that no parent, no teacher, no pastor could easily recognize. His quietness was no longer simply the gentleness of a reserved child. It carried weight now, like a memory trying to rise through layers of time. It began subtly, almost tenderly, as if whatever lived inside him was careful not to frighten the world it was entering. The first words came on a cold afternoon when Eleanor picked him up from kindergarten. The sky was grey, swollen with snow, and Cristian held tightly to her hand as they walked home. Halfway down the street, he stopped. His eyes drifted to a church at the corner, St. Helen's, an old stone building with a wooden door, always smelling faintly of candles and cold limestone. He stared at it for a long moment. Elena followed his gaze and asked softly, "Do you want to go in, Cristian?" He shook his head, but didn't look away. Instead, with a voice thin as breath and strangely steady, he whispered, "She knew the truth that the others feared." Elena froze. "Who, meu amor?" Cristian blinked, as if waking from a vision. "The woman with the red veil," he said. "The one who wasn't afraid of him." Elena felt her pulse shift. "Who are you talking about?" Cristian pressed his lips together, as though realizing he had said too much. He simply lowered his gaze and continued walking home. Elena hesitated, staring at the old church, suddenly unsettled by its silent presence. There had been no mention of veils, no lesson on biblical women, no stories told at home that could explain such a sentence. Yet Cristian spoke with familiarity, not curiosity, not imagination. Recognition. The second moment came days later. Samuel found Cristian sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, tracing shapes on the floor with his finger. They looked like letters, though not English letters. Curves, strokes, small circles, ancient-looking, almost like Greek or Aramaic, though Samuel had no reason to think of those languages. It just looked old. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Samuel asked gently. Cristian didn't look up. "It's her name," he murmured. Samuel smiled, thinking it was some imaginary friend. "And who is she?" Again that stillness, that solemnity far too large for a 5-year-old. "She walked beside him," Cristian said softly, "but they wrote her away." Samuel's smile faded slowly. A coldness touched the room, not frightening but reverent. "Elena," he called quietly, "vem aqui minuto." Cristian lifted his finger from the carpet. The shapes dissolved under his small hand, lost before either parent could interpret them. That night, the couple talked in whispers after Cristian fell asleep. "Elena, isso é normal." "He's only 5, she replied, though her voice trembled. Children imagine things, but deep in her chest, a truth pressed quietly against her denial. Nothing Cristian said felt imagined, and then came the third moment, the moment neither of them could forget. The family had visited a small antiquarian bookstore downtown, looking for an illustrated children's Bible for Cristian. While Elena browsed, Cristian wandered between the shelves. His steps were slow, almost guided. Suddenly, he stopped in front of a dusty glass case containing old religious reproductions, sketches of saints, fragments of manuscripts, verses handwritten by unknown hands. One of the sketches depicted a woman beside Jesus, not labeled, not formally identified, simply portrayed with a quiet dignity. Her posture was calm, her eyes gentle, her veil lightly shaded in red. Cristian's breath caught, and his small hand pressed against the glass. "That's her," he whispered. But they hid the rest. Elena rushed to him. "Cristian, don't touch the glass." He didn't move. His eyes had filled not with fear, but with longing. Longing in a 5-year-old boy. It made Elena's heart ache. "What do you mean they hid the rest?" she asked carefully. Cristian's fingers curled slowly, as though grasping something invisible. "They didn't want people to know who she really was," he said. "What she kept, what he trusted her with." Elena inhaled sharply. "Cristian, who told you that?" He turned to her, and in his gaze was something she could not explain, something deep, ancient, sorrowful, and steady all at once. "Nobody told me," he said. "I remember." The bookstore seemed to exhale at that moment, lights humming softly, dust shimmering in the air, the world tilting toward something sacred and impossible. Elena knelt in front of him, cupping his face gently. His skin was warm, his cheeks soft, his expression calm. He was her son. Yet for the first time, she looked into his eyes and felt as though she was staring into a depth older than her own life. "Cristian, remember what?" The boy blinked slowly. "The pages," he whispered, "the ones she wrote, the ones they took away." Elena felt tears rise unbidden. "No, no, my love, you're only a child." "I know," he whispered, almost as if apologizing, "but sometimes I'm not." A silence fell around them, a sacred, trembling silence that pressed against the heart like a revelation, too heavy for words. People continued browsing, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding beside them. But if you had been there, yes, you, standing between those old shelves, hearing that soft confession, you might have felt your own soul shiver. Because how could a child speak like that? How could he remember what was never taught? How could he look at a forgotten sketch and claim recognition? If your child said something like this, would your heart believe, or would you run from the truth you cannot understand? The world around Cristian was beginning to shift, subtly, inexorably, as though some veil between centuries had begun to thin. And in that thinning, the first threads of an ancient memory, a memory tied to a woman whose name carried both reverence and controversy, began to surface. The days after the bookstore incident did not return to normal. They couldn't. Something invisible had crossed a line inside that family's life, and even the silence at home felt different now. It was as if every ordinary object, the couch, the cross on the wall, the steaming cups of tea in the evening, had begun to listen. Samuel tried to brush it off. "He's imaginative," he told himself. "Kids say strange things." But when he closed his eyes at night, he saw Cristian's small hand pressed against the glass, his voice repeating like an echo. They didn't want people to know who she really was, what he trusted her with. Eleanor, however, could not cling to denial so easily. She had felt something in that bookstore, a stillness that did not belong to dust and paper. It felt like a presence. She found herself watching Cristian more closely, waiting for the next fragment, the next impossible sentence that would either break her faith or deepen it forever. It came sooner than she expected. One evening, snow tapped gently against the windows while the three of them sat around the small TV. Samuel was flipping between channels when a headline caught his eye. "Ancient manuscript about Mary Magdalene, new fragments decoded in 2022. He paused. The screen showed an image of a scholar holding a faded parchment, letters barely visible to the untrained eye. The newscaster spoke about early Christian texts, Gnostic writings, and how some scholars believed these fragments might offer a different perspective on Mary Magdalene, not as merely a repentant sinner, but as a prominent disciple. Samuel almost kept scrolling, but something stopped him. He increased the volume instead. Elena felt her chest tighten. Cristian, who had been quietly playing with a wooden block, lifted his head the moment the name Mary Magdalene was spoken aloud. His eyes sharpened, like a memory being pulled to the surface against its will. On the screen, the journalist continued. According to early translations, the text suggests a closer, spiritual relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, though scholars are still debating its meaning. Cristian moved closer, standing right in front of the TV, as if the images were calling him. "Turn it up," he said. His voice was calm, but something in it made Samuel obey without question. Elena watched him carefully. "Cristian, do you know who she is?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. He didn't respond. His gaze stayed fixed on the parchment displayed on the screen. Then, slowly, he whispered words they did not recognize. The sounds were soft, rhythmic, unlike any language they had heard him speak before. It wasn't English, it wasn't Portuguese, it wasn't the simple, invented speech of a child. It sounded old. The newscaster kept talking in the background, but his words faded in their ears. All they could hear was Cristian, murmuring a phrase with reverent certainty, as though reciting something he had known for a very long time. "Elena," Samuel's voice cracked. "Você está ouvindo isso?" She nodded, eyes wide, unable to speak. Finally, Cristian fell silent. He placed his small hand on the TV screen, right on top of the image of the manuscript. "They're reading it wrong," he said quietly. Samuel's throat went dry. "What do you mean, wrong?" Cristian's fingers traced the faded lines through the glass, as if following strokes that only he could see. "They think it's about jealousy," he said. "It's not. It's about trust. It's about what he gave her that he didn't give the others." Elena's heart pounded so loudly she could barely breathe. "What did he give her?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Cristian turned and looked at her. His face was still the face of a child, soft cheeks, small nose, lips stained with a little chocolate from earlier. But his eyes carried a sadness that did not belong to 5 years of life. "He gave her the words that couldn't be written yet," Cristian replied, "the ones that would only make sense after." Silence. Thick, electric. The TV continued its report, unaware of the greater revelation happening in that small living room. Samuel's faith had always been simple, straightforward. Jesus, the Bible, salvation, heaven. He prayed, he believed, and he tried not to complicate things. But now his son was standing in front of him, speaking like an echo from another century, talking about trust and unwritten words, as if he had been there, as if he had been close enough to see what no gospel fully told. Confusion rose inside Samuel like a storm. Was this demonic? Was it psychological? Was it some trick of imagination, or was it something else? Something holy but too large to fit into his tidy understanding of faith. That night, they argued in the kitchen while Cristian slept. "Helena, isso não é normal. A gente precisa levar ele num médico, num psicólogo, sei lá." "And if this isn't an illness," she replied, eyes shining with tears. "And if this is something allowed by God, something we're supposed to listen to, not silence?" Samuel shook his head, torn between fear and reverence. "Children don't talk about manuscripts and hidden words, Elena. They talk about cartoons and toys." "But you heard him," she insisted. "He didn't sound possessed. He sounded sad, like someone remembering a responsibility that never belonged to a child." Samuel leaned against the counter, closing his eyes. "And what do you think this is?" She hesitated. Then, with a trembling voice, she said, "I don't know. Maybe the past is closer than we think. Maybe there are things God allows to return, not to scare us, but to remind us of what we tried to bury." Samuel opened his eyes slowly. Fear was still there, but now it held something else beside it. Wonder. Meanwhile, Cristian lay in his small bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The shadows moved softly above him, but he wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt watched, not in a threatening way, more like being remembered. He whispered to the dark, not knowing exactly to whom he spoke. "They're reading you again," he said softly. "After so long. But they still don't hear you, do they?" A warmth brushed against his small chest, like an invisible hand placed gently over his heart. He closed his eyes, and for a fragment of a second, he saw something. Not Toronto, not snow, not electric lights, but a room lit by oil lamps, walls of stone, a woman sitting on the floor with a piece of parchment in her hands, her hair partly covered by a red veil, her face marked not by glamour but by strength and tenderness mixed. She wrote slowly, carefully, as if every stroke of ink carried the weight of a secret entrusted, not stolen. Cristian's lips trembled. A single tear slipped down his cheek. "I remember," he whispered, "but I don't know. From where?" The following days were filled with small, quiet signs. He would look at certain pages of a children's Bible and shake his head slightly, as if something was missing. During a prayer at church, when the pastor spoke bitterly about the sinful woman, Cristian's tiny hand tightened around Elena's fingers. "That's not all she was," he murmured. "They don't know." Elena's spine stiffened. "Who doesn't know, Cristian?" "Them," he said simply, glancing at the congregation. "Most of them never read her real words." And there it was again. That subtle but unmistakable conflict erupting inside the hearts of his parents. Part of them wanted to hush him, to tell him not to speak during service, to protect him from judgment and from being labeled as strange. But another part, deeper, older, wanted to kneel beside him and ask, "What else do you remember? What else did they hide?" Because really, if you were there, sitting on that wooden pew, hearing a 5-year-old boy correct the narrative spoken over centuries, would you have had the courage to ask more? Or would you have turned away, choosing the comfort of not knowing? How many times does the divine brush past us, wrapped in forms we do not expect? A child, a dream, a whisper, a strange. Familiarity with something ancient, and we dismiss it as nothing. And when we finally sense it might be something, are we ready? The mystery around Cristian was no longer a single event. It had become an atmosphere, a presence that followed him into rooms, into prayers, into quiet moments where the world felt closer to eternity than to time. The questions had begun. The conflict in his parents' hearts had started to grow. And somewhere, behind the veil of centuries, a name long misread and misunderstood seemed to stir, as if waiting for the right moment and the right voice to be heard again. The whisper about Cristian did not stay inside the apartment for long. Secrets that touch the sacred rarely remain confined to 4 walls. They move slowly and quietly, like incense rising in a small chapel, until someone breathes them in and feels compelled to respond. It began with a conversation that wasn't meant to be important. Elena sat with an elderly woman at the retirement home where she worked, helping her fold a soft blanket. The woman, Donna Isabel, had the habit of asking about Elena's family, especially Cristian. That afternoon, Elena answered mechanically at first. "He's growing, he's healthy, he's in school." But then a strange weight pulled on her chest. Without planning it, she added in a lower voice, "He says strange things sometimes, about someone in the Bible." Donna Isabel's hands paused, her eyes clouded by age sharpened just a little. "Strange? How?" she asked. Eleanor hesitated. "He talks about Mary Magdalene as if he remembers her, as if he knows something that no one taught him." The room grew still. A clock ticked softly on the wall. In the hallway, a cart squeaked past, but the sound felt distant. Donna Isabel crossed herself. Você precisa falar com o pastor James, she murmured. Ele não é daqueles que julgam rápido. Ele escuta, ele ora. Às vezes Deus fala através dessas coisas que nos assustam. Helena swallowed. She had indeed thought about speaking to someone at church, but fear held her back. What if they thought Cristian was disturbed? What if they said he was possessed? What if they tried to correct him, to silence him, and in doing so, silenced something holy? Ele vai achar que eu sou louca, Helena sussurrou. Então deixe ele achar, the older woman replied softly. Mas se o que seu filho está dizendo vem de Deus, verdadeiro pastor vai no mínimo escutar. That night, Helena and Samuel sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, a single candle burning between them. Falar com o pastor? Samuel repeated, uneasy. E se ele mandar a gente levar o Cristian para o psiquiatra? E se ele começar a dizer que é demônio? Helena looked at the flame. Then we will know what kind of shepherd he really is, she answered quietly. But I can't carry this alone. I need someone who knows the scriptures better than I do. I need someone who isn't afraid to hear what Cristian says. Samuel rubbed his forehead. The weight of a father is heavy when the inexplicable touches his child. Part of him wanted to hide Cristian from the world, to wrap him in normalcy and pretend nothing unusual was happening. But another part, the part that had felt that tremor when hearing his son's ancient words, knew they were already past the point of pretending. Okay, he sighed. We talk to Pastor James, but I go too. And if I feel anything wrong around this, we stop. Helena nodded. There, between fear and faith, hope silently slipped in. 2 days later, they stood inside the pastor's modest office at the church. It was not a grand room, not lined with gold or ancient icons, but it carried a gentle dignity. Shelves of well-worn Bibles and theological books filled the walls. A wooden cross hung above the small desk. A faint smell of coffee and old paper filled the air. Pastor James was in his late 50s, with greying hair and eyes that looked like they had seen both joy and sorrow, and carried both gently. He was known not for fiery sermons, but for being present at hospital bedsides, at funerals, at the quiet corners of people's pain. Please, he said softly, motioning them to sit. Tell me what brings you here. Samuel and Helena exchanged a glance. Then, haltingly at first, Helena began to speak. She told him about Cristian's strange phrases, about the woman with the red veil, about the bookstore, about the news report on the decoded manuscript, and the mysterious words Cristian had spoken. At first, Pastor James simply listened. No interruptions, no raised eyebrows, no quick theological explanations to bring everything back into a safe box. He listened the way one listens to something fragile and holy, slowly, carefully, as if each detail might be more than just a detail, but a small stone in a path God was quietly laying out. And he said they're reading it wrong, Helena finished, her voice unsteady. He says the manuscript isn't about jealousy, but about trust, about what Jesus gave her that he didn't give the others. The pastor's fingers interlaced over his knees. His gaze drifted for a moment to the cross on the wall, then back to them. And now, he asked softly, what are you afraid of? The question hit harder than any explanation. Helena felt her eyes fill with tears. I'm afraid they'll hurt him, she whispered, that people will mock him, that they will say terrible things about him, or about God, because of him. Samuel spoke next, his voice tight. I'm afraid of being deceived, of believing something that isn't from God. I don't want to open a door we can't close. Pastor James nodded slowly. Those are not small fears, he said gently. They are the right fears to bring before God. He looked at them for a long moment, then asked, would you be comfortable if I met Cristian? Not to interrogate him, not to test him, just to listen. Eleanor exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Yes," she said immediately. Samuel hesitated. Then he nodded as well. "Yes, but if he becomes uncomfortable, we stop." "Agreed," the pastor replied. That Sunday, instead of leaving the church immediately after service, the family stayed behind. Cristian clung lightly to Elena's hand as they walked toward the office. He didn't know all the details, but he sensed something. The adults were watching him more closely, and their eyes carried questions. When they entered the office, Pastor James smiled warmly and knelt down to Cristian's height. "Hi, Cristian," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard you're very observant." Cristian looked at his hand for a moment, then took it gently. "Sometimes," he answered simply. The pastor chuckled softly. "That's already more than many adults," he replied, standing. "Would you like to sit there?" He pointed to a small chair beside the bookshelf, close to where the afternoon light streamed in. Cristian sat. Samuel and Elena took their places on the couch. Pastor James did not open a Bible or a notebook. He just sat across from the boy, hands relaxed on his knees. "I want you to know something, Cristian," he began quietly. "I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. I'm not here to make you say things you don't want to say. I'm here to listen. If at any moment you don't want to talk anymore, you can stop. Is that okay?" Cristian studied him carefully, as if measuring the weight of his words. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." The pastor smiled. "Your parents told me that sometimes you feel like you remember things about a woman in the Bible. Is that true?" Cristian's gaze drifted to the window, where a thin ray of light touched the floor. "Not like a movie," he said slowly. "Not all at once. It's more like pieces of light and feelings that don't fit inside a kid." The room fell utterly silent. Pastor James' eyes softened. "Tell me about the woman," he said gently. "Only what you want." Cristian's small fingers played with a loose thread on his shirt. "She wasn't what they say," he murmured. "She wasn't just broken. She was brave. She stayed when others ran. She listened when others argued. He trusted her to hold things in her heart until the time was right." "Elena," Samuel whispered under his breath. She squeezed his hand, both terrified and transfixed. Pastor James leaned forward slightly. "Do you know her name?" he asked. Cristian nodded. "They call her Mary Magdalene now," he said, "but that's not how he said it." The pastor's voice remained calm, almost like someone walking barefoot in a holy place. "And how did he say it?" he asked. Cristian opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes grew moist. "I don't remember the sound," he whispered. "I just remember that when he said her name, the room felt safer." A shiver passed over Elena's arms. Something in that sentence felt too pure to be invented. Pastor James did not rush. He did not probe. Instead he asked, "And the manuscript, Cristian, the old pages people are reading again now, what do you feel when you see them?" Cristian swallowed. His little legs dangled from the chair, not touching the floor. He looked so small, and yet in that moment his face carried a solemnity that made the room feel like a sanctuary. "It hurts," he admitted, "because they only see pieces, like a song cut in half. They argue about the parts they can read and forget that there were words that never made it to paper, only to hearts." Samuel's chest tightened. "What kind of words?" he asked before he could stop himself. Cristian glanced at him. "Words about seeing. About how she could see him when others only saw what they wanted. Words about how love doesn't end at a tomb or at a cross. Words about staying when everything looks lost." Pastor James closed his eyes briefly. He knew the debates, the academic theories, the controversies surrounding Mary Magdalene through history. But this was different. This wasn't a child parroting theology or conspiracy theories. This was a child speaking with the tenderness of someone who had stood near a sorrow that changed the world. He opened his eyes again. "Cristian," he said gently, "has anyone ever told you that what you're saying is wrong?" The boy nodded slightly. "Sometimes grown-ups at church talk about her like she was dirty," he replied. "They say she was full of sin, that she was the worst. But that's not the whole thing." "And how does that make you feel?" Pastor James asked. Cristian's lower lip trembled. For the first time, the weight of his strange awareness seemed to press down on his small shoulders. "Alone," he whispered, "like I'm the only one who remembers that she was loved, not just forgiven. Loved, trusted." A silence filled the office, alive and almost unbearable in its beauty. Pastor James inhaled slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and knelt on the floor. Not before the boy, but beside him. "I don't understand everything you're saying," he admitted honestly, "but I don't feel darkness around it. I feel grief and a kind of holiness. I don't know exactly what God is doing here, Cristian, but I believe he is close." He turned his head, looking the boy in the eyes. "I am not here to decide if your memories are real or symbolic, if they come from another time or from a place deep in your soul. What I know is this: when you speak, I feel invited to look at Jesus and at Mary Magdalene with more reverence, not less. And that kind of invitation usually does not come from the enemy." Tears slid down Elena's cheeks. Samuel's jaw clenched as he tried to contain his own. The pastor continued, voice low. "Would it be okay if, from now on, instead of trying to make you forget, we simply walk with you? We pray, we listen, and we ask God to show us what he wants to heal, reveal, or remind through your life." Cristian's eyes filled now too. "So I'm not wrong?" he asked. "No," Pastor James said softly. "You are not wrong for feeling what you feel. You are not wrong for remembering what you remember. You are a child. And sometimes God places heavy things in gentle hands so that the world is forced to see them with tenderness." He placed a hand over his own heart. "If at any point this leads to pride, confusion, or pain that pulls you away from God's love, then we will stop and ask again what's happening. But for now, I choose not to silence you. I choose to listen." He looked up at Samuel and Eleanor. "And I promise you this," he added, "I will not speak of this from the pulpit. I will not expose your son. I will only be present. I will carry this with you in prayer and silence." A peace entered the room, quiet but deep, like water seeping into dry ground. Outside, the church halls were almost empty. A mop leaned against a wall. The last echo of footsteps faded. Inside the office, 4 lives sat within a moment that felt mysteriously larger than their years. And now imagine, honestly, if you were there. Would you have had the courage to sit in that chair across from Cristian, to look into the eyes of a 5-year-old boy who speaks like an echo from early centuries, and simply listen without rushing to label him? Would you have stood up quickly, afraid, dismissing it all as fantasy or deception? Or would you have felt beneath all the fear and all the questions that quiet, trembling certainty that sometimes heaven touches earth in ways that do not fit our doctrines, but still carry the scent of God? The pastor had chosen to stay, to listen. The parents had chosen not to shut the door, and the boy, finally, was no longer entirely alone with the weight of what he carried. From that day on, the mystery did not lessen, but it became shared. And when a mystery is shared in reverence, it often becomes a place where God whispers a little louder. News of Cristian's strange wisdom did not spread loudly. It moved the way sacred things often move, softly, quietly, from heart to heart, through whispers that people do not fully understand but cannot ignore. It began inside the church itself, not through gossip, but through presence. After the meeting with Pastor James, Cristian attended Sunday service as usual, yet nothing felt usual. The moment he walked through the sanctuary doors, several people turned, not because they had been told anything, but because something shifted in the air around him, a subtle gravity, a stillness inside the noise. Even those who didn't know him sensed it. They looked at him not with suspicion, but with that instinctive human awareness that rises when something out of the ordinary comes near. Elena felt it. Samuel felt it. And Pastor James. He felt it most intensely. He didn't understand, but he recognized the sensation, the gentle weight that sometimes filled hospital rooms when someone was close to seeing God. The quiet presence that sometimes came during prayer, like a soft brush of eternity across the heart. That same presence accompanied Cristian now, not overpowering, not dramatic, just undeniable. That week, small encounters began to happen, not planned, not forced. They simply happened, as if drawn to Cristian by an invisible thread. One afternoon, after service, an elderly man named Thomas approached Elena timidly. He was quiet, kind, and known for sitting in the same wooden pew every Sunday, hands trembling from age and grief. His wife had died the previous winter, leaving behind a silence he could not fill. He rarely spoke to anyone, but that day he knelt beside Cristian, who was sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden church toy. Thomas didn't say anything at first. He simply sat there, his old knees shaking. After a moment, Cristian looked up, studying the man's face, the deep lines of sorrow, the tired eyes, the years of love and longing etched in his expression. Cristian reached out and gently touched Thomas's wrist. "You miss her," he said softly. The old man's breath hitched, tears pooled in his eyes. How do you know that?" he whispered. Cristian tilted his head, almost apologetically. "Because the way you breathe feels like someone who lost their other half," he murmured. "She used to hold the part of your heart that stays quiet now." Thomas covered his face, overwhelmed, but the tears that fell were not painful, they were freeing. Elena watched, stunned. Samuel froze where he stood. Pastor James observed from a distance, trembling slightly, humbled by the sacredness of the moment. Cristian continued, voice gentle. "She is okay. She waits for you in a place where nothing hurts." The old man sobbed, but the sound was peaceful, like a wound finally opening to heal. And when he rose, his shoulders were a little lighter. He kissed Cristian's forehead and whispered, "Thank you, little one." That was the first touch. More followed. A young woman named Amelia, who rarely attended church due to her battle with depression, found herself drawn one evening to sit near the back pew while Pastor James prayed alone. She didn't want to talk to anyone. She didn't want to be seen. She simply wanted to sit in silence, hoping for a few minutes of relief from the storm inside her mind. Cristian was there with his parents waiting for the pastor to finish a short meeting. He noticed her, not with curiosity, but with that same deep sensitivity that had begun to characterize him. Slowly, he walked over and sat beside her, saying nothing. Amelia wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. "Hi," she managed. "You shouldn't sit near me, sweetheart. I'm not in a good place." Cristian shook his head. "But you came to the church," he said calmly. "That means you're looking for somewhere safe to breathe." The woman let out a shaky laugh. "You're 5, she murmured. "You're not supposed to say things like that." Cristian looked down at his hands. "Sometimes I say things that make grown-ups feel strange," he whispered. "But I don't mean to. I just feel when someone needs someone to sit next to them." Amelia bit her lip, tears falling again. "How do you know?" she whispered. Cristian's voice softened. "Because you're tired of being alone with things that scare you." She closed her eyes. Cristian placed his tiny hand on hers, and something inside Amelia, something tightly coiled for months, loosened. Not healed completely, not erased, but loosened, the way a heavy knot loosens before it finally unravels. Pastor James later wrote in his private journal that he had seen burdens lifted by sermons, by prayers, by worship, but never by the presence of a silent child. As the days went on, Cristian's presence began to affect even those who didn't speak to him directly. People found themselves calmer around him, more introspective, more willing to forgive small grievances or confess unnoticed guilt. Some said they felt a warmth when he looked at them. Others said they felt seen, not judged, but deeply understood. Samuel, ever protective, worried. "What if people misunderstand?" he told Elena late one night. "What if they think we're encouraging this? What if they think he's some kind of prophet?" Elena shook her head. "He's not preaching," she whispered. "He's not trying to be anything. He's just being Christian." Samuel sighed heavily. "But people are drawn to him." "Yes," Elena replied softly, "because he touches something they forgot they had, something sacred and quiet." Even those skeptical of spiritual matters found themselves unable to dismiss the peace that followed Cristian. A man who rarely prayed lingered in the sanctuary just a little longer, feeling something stir in him for the first time in years. A mother, estranged from her daughter, found the courage to send a message of reconciliation after Cristian smiled at her in the hallway. It wasn't miracles in the traditional sense, no supernatural displays, no glowing lights or thunderous voices. It was something subtler, but in many ways more powerful. Human hearts rediscovering softness. A woman described it perfectly to Pastor James. "It's like the boy carries an echo of something, ancient, not heavy, not dark, just full of meaning. When he looks at you, you feel like God hasn't forgotten you." The pastor wrote that sentence down. He would return to it many times. But alongside the peace, something else began to grow, a quiet fear. Not of Cristian himself, but of what his presence suggested. People felt the touch of the divine near him, but the divine always brings a question. Why now? Why him? And what is being stirred beneath the surface? Some whispered that perhaps he was remembering things God wanted the world to recall. Others feared that touching such mystery could shake their faith instead of deepening it. And you, if you had been there, sitting among those wooden pews, hearing those small interactions ripple through the community, what would you have felt? Would you have opened your heart and let the mystery in, risking the comfort of certainty? Or would you have looked away, choosing the safety of familiar answers? Because the truth is this: sometimes a child steps into a community not to teach doctrine, not to challenge theology, but to awaken something old, something forgotten but always present, like embers beneath ash. And Cristian, without knowing it, had become a walking ember. Wherever he stepped, things warmed, shadows softened, people remembered their own souls. Yet this rising warmth was only the beginning. The moment was coming, slowly, inevitably, when the child would say something not only beautiful, but unignorable. Something that would leave the entire community breathless. Something tied not to their personal pain, but to a truth that had been buried for centuries. And when that moment arrived, the silence that followed would not be ordinary silence. It would be the kind of silence that falls when heaven leans close and waits. Winter was loosening its grip on Toronto when the moment finally came. The moment no one in the community could ever forget. A night the church would speak of in whispers for years afterward. A night when the air itself felt ancient. Pastor James had organized a small vigil for Lent, a quiet gathering meant only for prayer, reflection, and gentle worship. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, just candles, scripture, soft hymns, and silence. But sometimes heaven chooses precisely the quiet moments to stir the deepest waters. About 30 people attended, families, elderly members, a few teenagers, and Cristian with his parents. They sat scattered around the sanctuary, candles flickering beside them, warm against the cold outside. Snow pressed softly against the stained glass windows, muting the world into stillness. Cristian sat near the front, legs tucked under the pew, hands folded in his lap. He looked peaceful, but Elena could tell something simmered beneath the surface, like the slow glow of embers. Pastor James began the vigil with a simple reading. "Tonight," he said softly, "we remember love that stayed even when the world turned away." His voice floated through the room, warm as the candlelight. No one expected anything unusual. And then it began. During a long moment of silence, when the pastor invited everyone to pray in their own way, Cristian suddenly straightened his back. His breath hitched softly, almost like a memory brushing past him. Samuel leaned forward instinctively, sensing the shift. Elena reached for Cristian's hand, but Cristian wasn't afraid. His eyes lifted to the candle on the altar, and something in his expression changed, not older, not possessed, but deeply awake. He rose from the pew quietly, no dramatic movement, no trembling. He simply stood. People noticed. The room fell even more silent. The flame on the altar flickered as if acknowledging him. Pastor James looked up. Their eyes met, and the pastor felt an instinctive reverence wash over him, the kind that makes a shepherd remove his shoes in holy places. Cristian stepped forward. Still silence. Stillness. Breath held everywhere. He walked toward the small wooden stand where the pastor had placed a printed copy of the newly decoded manuscript fragments, something he intended to discuss academically next week, not tonight. The papers lay untouched, marked with ink translations and notes from theologians. Cristian reached the stand. He placed his small hand on the papers, and then he spoke. His voice was soft, but the room heard every syllable as if the walls leaned in. "They forgot the part where she stayed," he whispered. Pastor James felt the world tilt. "She was there," Cristian continued, eyes shining, "when the morning light touched the stone, before the others, before the fear could chase her away." A murmur rippled through the sanctuary. Cristian wasn't repeating scripture. He wasn't quoting the Gospels. He was speaking from a place deeper than memory and older than 5 years of life. His gaze moved across the room, innocent yet unbearably solemn. "They argued about her," he said. "They didn't understand why he trusted her, why he spoke to her first, why he gave her the message." A woman in the back pressed a hand to her mouth. Another wiped tears from her eyes without understanding why. "What message, Cristian?" Pastor James asked, voice barely a breath. He felt like he was questioning something sacred, but the question came out on its own. Cristian blinked slowly. "The one they weren't ready to hear," he said. "The one about love that is stronger than fear, and sight that sees beyond death." A tremor went through the entire congregation, not fear, recognition. Cristian lowered his eyes to the manuscript papers beneath his hand. "They're reading it like words," he whispered. "But it was never meant to be only words. She wrote with her tears, with her waiting, with her knowing." His voice cracked slightly, a tiny human sound, but it was enough to break several hearts open. Elena sobbed silently. Samuel placed a trembling arm around her. Pastor James felt tears burning behind his eyelids. Cristian lifted his head again. Then he said the sentence that ended all breath in the room. He called her the keeper of the hidden morning. Gasps. Soft, sharp, holy gasps. No manuscript ever recorded such a phrase. No scholar ever proposed it. No child should know those words. Yet when Cristian spoke them, every soul in the sanctuary felt something inside their chest respond, as if a forgotten truth had just been uncovered. The hidden mourning, Pastor James whispered, stunned. Cristian, what does that mean? Cristian's eyes filled with tears, though he didn't cry. It means she carried the dawn in her heart, he murmured, even when the world was still dark, even when hope looked impossible. The candle flames flickered higher, though no wind touched them. The silence in the room deepened into something living, a silence that watched, that listened, that understood. Cristian stepped back from the stand. He looked at the pastor, at his parents, at everyone. And then, with the smallest, saddest smile, he added, he trusted her with the beginning that hadn't happened yet. A woman near the aisle fell to her knees. Thomas, the elderly widower, pressed his hand over his heart and wept openly. A teenage boy who rarely felt anything during service wiped his eyes. And Pastor James bowed his head, overcome, whispering a silent prayer he didn't know how to form. The presence in the room thickened, gentle yet immense, not oppressive, not frightening, but unmistakably sacred. It was as if time itself paused to listen. Cristian's voice broke the stillness one final time. Don't argue about her, he said softly. Just see her the way he saw her. Then he sat down, just like that, a child again, small, quiet. His feet swung beneath the pew, but nothing in the sanctuary was the same. The vigil ended in silence, true silence, the kind that vibrates inside the soul. No one rushed to leave, no one dared speak above a whisper. Some people touched the pews as if grounding themselves. Others held their faces in their hands, trembling. Even you, if you had been there, would you have had the courage to speak? Or would you, like everyone else, have simply sat in awe, afraid that any word you said would break the fragile holiness hanging in the air? Because in that moment, the community did not just witness a child say something profound. They witnessed a wound in history open and a forgotten truth breathe. They witnessed a memory that was never written on paper, but carried through centuries, slip quietly into the world again, through the lips of a 5-year-old. And above it all, a presence lingered, a presence that felt like dawn itself, waiting to rise. In the days following the vigil, a gentle hush settled over the community. Not the hush of fear nor of superstition, but the tender quiet that follows a revelation too sacred to place into ordinary words. The sanctuary still held the memory of that night. If someone entered alone during the week, they sometimes felt it, the faint echo of a child's voice, or the strange sensation that the room was listening. But Cristian returned to being Cristian. Not entirely unchanged, no one could witness the dawning of an ancient truth without carrying its light, but he returned to his small routines. He woke early, rubbing sleep from his eyes, asking for warm oatmeal. He played with his wooden toys. He watched cartoons, laughed at silly sounds, asked his mother why clouds looked like sleeping sheep. He held his father's hand with the same small grip that reminded Samuel of how young he really was. Life tried to settle again, and yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted permanently. Elena noticed it first. She saw it in the smallest things. The way Cristian paused when touching the wooden cross near the kitchen, not with mystery now, but with peace. The way he no longer woke at night staring at the window, as if expecting memories to pour through the sky. The way he hummed soft, unknown melodies while drawing simple shapes on paper. It wasn't that the memories disappeared. It was that they rested, like ripples that had finally reached the shore. One chilly morning, Cristian sat at the table coloring a simple picture. A stone, a sunrise, a woman standing near its light. Elena watched him quietly. "Who is she?" she asked gently. Cristian smiled, a small, sweet smile untouched by burden. "Just someone who loved," he answered. "Not a title, not a role, not a controversy, just someone who loved." Elena felt tears warming her eyes because the answer wasn't mysterious anymore. It was simply true, deeper than history, deeper than doctrine, deeper than everything adults try to define. Cristian no longer spoke as if carrying a weight too heavy for his age. The sharp sadness that once flickered in his eyes had softened, replaced by a tenderness that seemed to settle inside him like a quiet soul finally allowed to breathe. It was as if the revelations he had carried, whether memory, spiritual echo, or divine whisper, had completed their purpose and now rested like gentle light beneath his childhood. Pastor James saw it too. During a follow-up conversation at the church, he sat across from Cristian and asked softly, "How do you feel now, after everything?" Cristian shrugged lightly, legs swinging above the floor. "Like when you finish a song," he said. "You still hear it in your heart, but you don't need to sing it anymore." The pastor's eyes moistened. "And do you feel afraid?" Cristian shook his head. "No. I feel warm. Like the morning is close. Blesses." The pastor closed his eyes for a moment, letting those words settle. Not prophetic, not heavy, just luminous. The community, touched by the mystery, began to live differently too. Thomas, the widower, began praying with gratitude instead of longing. Amelia, the young woman with depression, started attending counseling and returned to church with a growing softness in her spirit. Parents held their children more tightly. Husbands apologized to wives. Old grievances dissolved in unexpected forgiveness. It wasn't Cristian who changed them. It was what they had witnessed through him. The strange reminder that God sometimes speaks not through thunder, but through small voices, through impossible tenderness, through truths that never made it into history books, but lived on in hearts. People didn't talk about that night loudly. They didn't advertise it. They didn't try to explain it. Instead, it became something like a shared secret between souls, not hidden, but treasured, a sacred memory, a dawn they had all seen together. Weeks passed. Spring approached. Snow melted into soft rivers, running along Toronto's sidewalks. Children played outside again, their laughter echoing against brick walls. Cristian joined them, running, stumbling, laughing. A real child, a light child. But sometimes, rarely and only for a brief moment, he would stop and look toward the horizon, as if sensing a distant sunrise. And in those moments, something in him shone softly, like a candle remembering the flame that once lit it. One afternoon, while sitting with Pastor James in the garden behind the church, Cristian picked up a small white stone. He held it thoughtfully. "She was never meant to be forgotten," he said simply. The pastor nodded, voice thick. "No," he whispered. "I don't think she ever was." Cristian set the stone down. "Can I go play now?" "Yes, Cristian," Pastor James smiled. "Go." He watched the boy run into the sunlight, and he felt something stir inside him. Something he hadn't felt since he was very young. Hope. Not the loud kind that shouts through sermons. The quiet kind that sits gently in the heart, waiting for the right moment to rise. At home, things also softened. Samuel stopped fearing what he didn't understand. Elena stopped holding her breath. Their home felt lighter, as if a window had been opened after a long winter. One evening, as Cristian drifted towards sleep, Elena tucked him in and asked softly, "Do you remember everything you said about the hidden morning?" Cristian's eyes were half closed. He smiled faintly. "Not everything," he whispered, "just what love feels like when it isn't afraid." Eleanor's breath caught. "What does it feel like?" Cristian answered without opening his eyes. "It feels like God whispering to the world, 'Don't be afraid of the dawn.'" And then, slowly, the mystery grew quiet. Not gone, not erased, just quiet. Cristian no longer needed to speak the ancient words that once pressed on his heart. The community no longer needed signs. Pastor James no longer waited for revelations. What had been unveiled had done its work, restoring gentleness, stirring forgotten faith, healing wounds, reminding hearts of the beauty they had buried. Silence replaced wonder. Peace replaced trembling. Eternity replaced questions. Because in the end, some mysteries are not given to be solved, they are given to awaken the soul. And the greatest truths, the ones God whispers, not shouts, rarely stay loud for long. They settle, they root, they bloom quietly in the hidden corners of ordinary life. If you had been there, if you had walked through that quiet church weeks after the vigil, you might have felt something hum beneath the floorboards. Not fear, not strangeness, something like gratitude. As if heaven itself had leaned close for a moment, as if a forgotten story had found breath again, as if a small child had carried a dawn the world had forgotten how to see. And now, the dawn rests. The boy sleeps peacefully. The community breathes softly. The mystery has returned to its sacred silence. But every once in a while, when the morning light touches the stone walls of the church just right, some say the sanctuary glows a little warmer, as if someone, somewhere, is still keeping the hidden morning.